Imagine the Pacific sky in 1943. Somewhere over the jagged green spine of New Guinea, a lone P-38 Lightning is doing something no sane pilot would attempt. It's diving, not retreating, not maneuvering defensively, diving headfirst into a formation of Japanese Zeros. Not one, not three, a full formation. And the man inside that cockpit isn't panicking. He isn't praying. He's calculating. He's hunting. And when his commanding officer lands and sees the gun camera footage, he doesn't reach for a medal. He reaches for a grounding order. You are reckless, they told him. You are dangerous. You are a liability. And for a brief, suffocating moment, one of the most gifted aerial killers the United States Army Air Forces had ever produced was pulled from the sky. He was born to rule. Then the Japanese kept coming, and the phone rang. To understand why Tommy McGuire flew the way he did, to understand why the Air Force both feared and desperately needed him, you have to understand the Pacific War from the air, because it was nothing like Europe. Nothing at all. In Europe, American pilots flew against the Luftwaffe over relatively short distances, with established airfields, a sophisticated logistics network, and the English Channel as something of a psychological anchor. Lose your engine over France, and you might, just might, glide to safety. The stakes were horrifying, yes, but the geography had edges you could reason with. The Pacific had no such mercy. The theater stretched across more than 64 million square kilometers of open ocean, dense jungle, and volcanic island chains. Distances that would span from New York to Moscow were routine patrol lengths. A damaged aircraft over the Bismarck Sea didn't glide to safety. It fell into water so remote that search and rescue was, in many cases, a polite fiction. Pilots knew this. They flew with that knowledge sitting in their chests like a stone. And the enemy they faced was not to be underestimated. The Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service and the Army Air Force had spent a decade forging their pilots in the crucible of the Sino-Japanese War. Many of the men flying Mitsubishi A6M0s, the aircraft the Allies had dubbed the Zeke, had logged combat hours before the attack on Pearl Harbor. They were professionals, seasoned, disciplined, and flying a machine that, in 1941 and into 1942, was genuinely the most maneuverable fighter in the Pacific theater. The Zero weighed roughly 2,400 kilograms fully loaded. It could turn inside almost any Allied aircraft. At low and medium altitudes, it was almost supernatural in its agility. It could climb at over 3,000 feet per minute, reach a top speed of approximately 331 miles per hour, and its range, nearly 1,930 miles, made a ghost that appeared everywhere and belonged nowhere. Early American pilots who tried to dogfight on its own terms, turning, banking, matching it move for move in close quarters, died in shocking numbers. The lessons cost blood to learn. By late 1942, the United States had already suffered catastrophic losses in the Pacific Air War. At the Battle of the Coral Sea, at Midway, over Guadalcanal, the casualty figures among American airmen were sobering. The Japanese pipeline of trained pilots was also beginning to thin. Their losses at Midway in June 1942 had been a wound that would never fully heal. But nobody knew that yet from the cockpit of an outnumbered American fighter, what was needed in the Pacific was not merely bravery. Bravery was everywhere. What was needed was a new kind of pilot, a predator who had absorbed every lesson about the Zero's strengths and weaknesses, internalized them so completely that they became instinct, and who combined that knowledge with an aggression so precisely calibrated it became a tactical weapon in itself. Thomas Buchanan McGuire, Jr. was 22 years old when he arrived in the Pacific. He would redefine what a fighter pilot could be. He was born on August 1st, 1920, in Ridgewood, New Jersey, the son of a man who had been a boxer, a man who understood that fighting wasn't about size or anger. It was about positioning, timing, and the willingness to absorb pain long enough to deliver a finishing blow. Tommy McGuire absorbed that lesson before he understood it consciously. His parents' marriage collapsed when he was young, and his mother relocated to Sebring, Florida, a small town in the central part of the state. It was there that McGuire grew up, in the Florida sun, with its flat horizon and that particular quality of light over warm, humid air that does something to a young person's relationship with the sky. He watched aircraft. He drew them. He thought about them with an obsessive focus that his teachers found alternately impressive and slightly alarming. He enrolled at Georgia Tech in Atlanta, studying aeronautical engineering. This is worth pausing on for a moment, because it matters profoundly to what comes later. Tommy McGuire wasn't just a natural flyer. He was a student of flight. He understood the physics. He understood the mathematics of lift and drag and thrust. He understood, at a level most combat pilots never reached, precisely what an aircraft could and could not do, and exactly where the boundary between those two conditions lived. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant in February 1942, less than 3 months after Pearl Harbor. He received his pilot's wings the same month. He was 21 years old, and the world was on fire. His early postings were frustrating. He spent time in Alaska, assigned to a defense posture that felt, to a young man burning with the urgency of the war, like being locked in a very cold room while the fight happened elsewhere. He requested transfers. He pushed. He maneuvered through the bureaucracy with the same aggression he would later bring to aerial combat. In the spring of 1943, his persistence paid off. He was assigned to the Southwest Pacific area, under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, fly with what would become one of the most famous fighter groups in American history, the 475th Fighter Group, 431st Fighter Squadron, and his aircraft was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. If the Zero was a scalpel, precise, nimble, elegant, the P-38 was something else entirely. It was a statement, a twin-engine, twin-boom fighter that looked, from certain angles, like something from a science fiction novel. It stretched nearly 40 feet from wingtip to wingtip. Its twin Allison V 1710 engines combined to produce approximately 2,600 horsepower. It could reach altitudes above 44,000 feet, high enough that the air grew thin and the world below curved perceptibly. Its top speed exceeded 440 miles per hour in level flight, and in a dive, it approached velocities that tested the laws of aerodynamics themselves. Most critically, it carried an armament package that was almost obscene in its concentration, for .50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns and a single 20mm Hispano autocannon, all mounted in the nose. Unlike most fighters of the era, where guns were mounted in the wings and their trajectories had to converge at a specific point called a harmonization distance, the P-38's nose-mounted weapons fired in a perfectly parallel line. At any range, the full weight of fire landed in a tight, devastating cluster. Hit something with a P-38's guns, and you didn't need to hit again. Tommy McGuire fell in love with it immediately. He understood, with the clarity of an engineer and the instinct of a natural predator, that the P-38's advantages over the Zero were specific and decisive if you used them correctly. The P-38 could dive faster. It could climb faster at altitude. It could absorb punishment that would shred a Zero. And its twin engines meant that a single engine failure over Pacific Ocean was uncomfortable, not fatal. But the Zero could still outturn it at low altitude. And if you got into a slow, twisting, low-energy dogfight with a Zero pilot who knew what he was doing, the P-38's advantages evaporated. The Zero pilots were trained for that environment. They were patient, calculated hunters who would drag you down to the deck and turn you in circles until your machine or your nerve gave out. McGuire's solution was simple in concept and ferocious in execution. Never let them drag you down. Strike fast, strike hard, strike from altitude. Convert every engagement into a high-speed slashing attack that the Zero simply could not match, and never, ever, accept a fight on enemy's terms. He called it energy fighting, though he wouldn't have used that term. The formal doctrine of energy management in aerial combat wouldn't be codified until after the war, when a pilot and theorist named John Boyd would build an entire philosophy around it. But McGuire was practicing it intuitively, with brutal effectiveness, from the moment he arrived in the Pacific. His first aerial victory came on August 18th, 1943, a Mitsubishi Zero, engaged and dispatched with a clinical precision that startled his flight leader. His second and third followed within weeks. By the end of 1943, he had accumulated a score that put him on the radar of every senior officer in the Southwest Pacific Air Forces. He was also starting to worry some of them. The word used most frequently in official reports about McGuire during this period was aggressive. At first, it was meant as a compliment. In aerial combat, timidity kills. A pilot who hesitates, who second-guesses, who pulls away from an engagement at the critical moment, doesn't survive long. Aggression, controlled, intelligent aggression, was a survival trait and a combat multiplier. But McGuire's aggression, some felt, had crossed a line from control to something that made senior officers deeply uncomfortable. He would pursue. That was the issue. When a more cautious pilot would break off an engagement, when the tactical calculus of fuel, ammunition, distance from base, and surrounding threats suggested that discretion was the appropriate response, McGuire kept going. He chased. He followed Japanese aircraft further than regulations permitted, deeper into contested airspace that his orders authorized, lower and faster, and longer than anyone was comfortable watching. He wasn't reckless in the way that word implies stupidity. He wasn't drunk on adrenaline, confused about the risks, or lacking in situational awareness. He was making calculated decisions that his superiors sometimes believed were the right ones and sometimes believed were the wrong ones, but that were almost always effective. Almost always. There was an incident. The precise details remain somewhat obscured in the historical record, which itself says something about how the Air Force handled the aftermath, where McGuire pursued a Japanese formation far beyond the point where common sense and fuel mathematics suggested he should have broken off. He came back with more kills. He also came back with a nearly empty fuel gauge and a commanding officer who had spent the better part of an hour wondering whether he was going to have to write a letter to Sebring, Florida. The grounding order came down. It was not a lengthy grounding. In the grinding arithmetic of the Pacific Air War, a pilot of McGuire's demonstrated ability was too valuable to keep on the ground for long. But it happened. He was pulled from flight status, informed in clear and unmistakable terms that his instincts, however impressive their results, needed to be brought within the framework of command discipline, and told to consider whether he understood the distinction between bravery and recklessness. McGuire sat on the ground and seethed. He didn't argue. He didn't rage. He processed. He studied. He thought about everything he'd done, every engagement, every decision point, and he came to conclusions that were characteristically his own. He didn't conclude that he'd been wrong. He concluded that he needed to be smarter about how he communicated his decisions, and that his fundamental approach was correct, and that the war would eventually prove it. He was right on both counts, because the Japanese kept coming. In late 1943 and into 1944, the Japanese Imperial forces, though strategically on the defensive following the catastrophe at Midway and the grinding attrition of Guadalcanal, were far from a spent force in the air. The Imperial Japanese Navy was executing Operation Igo, pouring aircraft and pilots into the New Guinea and Solomon Islands theater in an effort to establish air superiority over the Allied advance. The numbers were significant. At various points, Japanese air groups in the region fielded hundreds of aircraft, and their pilots, particularly the veterans of earlier campaigns, remained dangerous opponents. The 475th Fighter Group, Satan's Angels, as they were nicknamed, was at the sharp end of this contest. Every serviceable P-38 and every experienced P-38 pilot was a resource the command could not afford to squander. And sitting on the ground in a theater where Japanese formations were testing Allied air defenses daily was a man with 20-something kills and an intuitive understanding of aerial combat that his superiors had never quite seen before. The grounding order was lifted. McGuire went back to the sky. And over the next year, what followed was one of the most extraordinary individual combat performances in the history of aerial warfare. To understand what McGuire actually did up there, to grasp the texture of what his combat flying looked like from the outside and from the inside, you need to understand the nature of aerial combat in the Pacific in a way that news reports and official citations rarely captured. A typical fighter engagement in 1944 over New Guinea or the Philippines lasted between 30 seconds and 3 minutes from first contact to resolution. That sounds brief. It was brief. But inside those seconds, a pilot was making decisions at a rate and with a consequence that is difficult to fully communicate. Airspeed, altitude, angle of bank, the position of the sun, the number of enemy aircraft visible, the fuel state, the ammunition remaining, the positions of friendly aircraft, the predicted trajectory of the enemy at their current speed and heading, and underneath all of it, The physical demands of a high-G environment, where simply keeping consciousness as you yanked the stick through a hard turn required a level of physical conditioning that few athletes could match. 38 pilots in combat regularly experience G-forces of 5 to 7 times normal gravity in tight maneuvers. At 5 Gs, the human body weighs 5 times its normal weight. Blood drains from the brain toward the lower extremities. Vision narrows, first losing color, then peripheral vision, then narrowing to a shrinking tunnel. Hold it long enough, or push it higher, and you black out. You regain consciousness to find your aircraft in some attitude, and at some altitude that may or may not be recoverable. McGuire built physical conditioning into his daily routine with an intensity unusual even among combat pilots. He understood that his ability to maintain consciousness and decision-making coherence at high Gs was a tactical advantage, and he trained for it with the same systematic focus he brought to his aircraft knowledge. He also developed, over the course of his combat tour, a philosophy of engagement that he communicated to his wingmen and flight members with unusual clarity and precision. The basic elements were these. Altitude is life. Enter every engagement with more altitude than the enemy. Altitude converts to speed in a dive, and speed is the P-38's primary advantage over the zero. Never surrender altitude to a zero pilot. They want you down at their level, and at their level, you are in their house. Speed is security. AP. 38 moving fast through a formation of zeros is a difficult target. AP. 38 slowing down, banking, trying to stay in a turning fight, becomes vulnerable. Get in, fire, get out. The geometry of the attack should always be constructed so that you are accelerating through the kill and climbing back to altitude afterward. Position before firing. McGuire had a reputation for getting very close before he fired. Uncomfortably, dangerously close by the standards of some of his contemporaries. This was not recklessness. This was the application of engineering knowledge. At close range, the effects of deflection and bullet drop and target movement are minimized. At close range, a full burst from AP-38's nose armament hits with a concentration of fire that is simply lethal. The aircraft you're shooting has less time to recognize the attack and react. McGuire accepted the risk of proximity because he understood quantitatively that it dramatically increased his probability of a kill with a given firing opportunity. And finally, the element that had gotten him grounded and that he never entirely abandoned. If you have the advantage, press it. Don't let the enemy break away to fight another day. Don't let them recover their altitude and their composure and come back around to kill your wingman. If the tactical situation permits aggression, be aggressive. He preached this to his men. He modeled it every time he flew. And gradually, the 431st Fighter Squadron became something more than a collection of individual pilots. It became a coherent tactical organism, with McGuire's philosophy embedded in its habits and reflexes. His aircraft, through this period, bore names that told a story of their own. McGuire named his P-38s Pudgy, a nickname for his wife, Marilyn, whom he had married in 1943 before heading back to the Pacific. The name appeared on a succession of aircraft as he flew through them: Pudgy, Pudgy 2, Pudgy 3, Pudgy 4, Pudgy V. Each one carried the same name, and each one carried the same pilot into the same relentless pursuit of the same mission: to kill Japanese aircraft and come home to Maryland. The personal motivation is worth dwelling on, because it matters to the story's ending. Tommy McGuire was deeply, genuinely in love with his wife. Their correspondence during the war reflects a man who thought about her constantly, who planned for a future that included her, who understood that every mission he flew was a gamble against the odds of seeing her again. This was not a man who flew recklessly because he didn't value his life. This was a man who flew aggressively because he believed, with a fighter pilot's confidence and an engineer's calculation, that aggression, properly applied, was actually the safest option. He may have been right on balance. His score kept climbing. 20 kills, 25, 30. By November 1944, Tommy McGuire had 31 confirmed aerial victories, making him the second highest scoring American ace in the entire war, behind only his friend and rival Richard Bong, who flew in the same theater and whom McGuire was, quite openly, competing against for the title of top American ace. Bong was the acknowledged leader, calm, methodical, technically superb, beloved by everyone who met him. He and McGuire were, in many ways, opposites who ended up at the same destination by different roads. Bong was the poet. McGuire was the mathematician who had learned to think like a poet in the air. The competition between them was real, documented, and good-natured, mostly. Bong's score at this point was 35. McGuire was 7 kills behind. The war in the Pacific was in its final phase, with American forces advancing to the Philippines and the Japanese air forces fighting a desperate rearguard action. Time was running out. Opportunities were becoming rarer as the Japanese conserved their remaining experienced pilots. McGuire knew it. He flew every mission he could get. He pushed. He pressed. He closed the gap. And then came the days that would define everything. December 25th and 26th, 1944. Christmas in the Pacific. There is something almost unbearable about that conjunction. The holiday, the season of peace, and the sky over the Philippines filled with killing machines. McGuire flew on Christmas Day and shot down 3 Japanese aircraft. 3 in a single day. He flew again on December 26th. He shot down 3 more. 6 kills in 2 days. His total now stood at 38 confirmed aerial victories. He needed 2 more to tie Bong, 3 more to surpass him. The entire Air Force was watching, and McGuire, characteristically, could not wait. He began lobbying immediately for more missions. He pushed his commanding officers, worked the scheduling, volunteered for patrols that a man of his rank and status could reasonably have left to less experienced pilots. Senior officers tried to slow him down. He was too valuable, they argued, both as a pilot and as a squadron leader and mentor, to be risked unnecessarily. There was talk, again, of pulling him back, not grounding him entirely this time, but reducing his exposure, managing his risk, protecting the asset. McGuire pushed back. He needed those kills. He needed them for the record. He needed them for the competition with Bong. He needed them, perhaps, for reasons he himself couldn't fully articulate. Something about having flown this far, having paid this much, having stood on the edge of this particular precipice for so long that stopping now felt like a kind of death itself. On the morning of January 7th, 1945, Thomas McGuire led a 4-aircraft volunteer patrol over Los Negros Island in the Philippines. He was not supposed to be on this mission by rank. He went anyway. The patrol consisted of 4 P-38s. McGuire led. His wingman was a young pilot. The other 2 were experienced hands. Their mission was a fighter sweep, a patrol designed to intercept Japanese aircraft in a specific area and engage them. What they found, or what found them, was a single Japanese pilot in a Nakajima Ki 43, a fighter called the Oscar by Allied intelligence, a single aircraft, significantly outgunned by 4 P-38s. Under normal circumstances, this should have been the easiest kind of engagement, a quick, decisive, overwhelming attack, and then home. But circumstances had conspired against normal. The P-38 still carried their external drop tanks, the large auxiliary fuel tanks that extended their range, but also dramatically affected their handling. Drop tanks were supposed to be jettisoned before a combat engagement. They increased drag, reduced maneuverability, and in a hard maneuvering fight, they were a significant liability. Standard doctrine was clear. Enemy aircraft spotted, drop tanks jettisoned, engage. What happened next is reconstructed from the accounts of the surviving pilots, and there is some uncertainty about the precise sequence of events. What is clear is this. McGuire's drop tanks were not jettisoned when the engagement began. The Japanese pilot, later identified as Sergeant Akira Sugimoto, a skilled and experienced veteran, did not run. He turned into the American formation. He was 1 aircraft against 4, but he had seen the drop tanks still hanging from the American machines, and he understood what that meant for their handling. He forced the engagement to the deck. Low altitude, low airspeed, a turning fight. Exactly the environment where the P-38's advantages disappear and the Japanese fighter's superior low-speed maneuverability becomes decisive. Exactly the scenario Tommy McGuire had spent 2 years teaching his pilots to avoid. And then the thing happened that nobody who knew McGuire could quite explain afterward, and that haunted the surviving pilots for the rest of their lives. McGuire's wingman, young, less experienced, flying in the difficult, demanding position behind his flight leader, got into trouble. He was slow, turning hard, vulnerable. McGuire broke his own rules. He rolled his P-38 into a hard, low, slow turn to help his wingman, with drop tanks still attached, at low altitude, in exactly the kind of engagement he had preached against 1,000 times. The P-38 stalled. At low altitude, a stall is not a recoverable situation. At high altitude, a pilot can push the nose down, build airspeed, regain control, and fly out of it. At low altitude, at the few hundred feet above the jungle canopy where this engagement was happening, there is no altitude to trade for airspeed. There is only the ground. McGuire's P-38 rolled and went in. He was 24 years old. The silence that followed, in the squadron, in the group, across the Southwest Pacific Air Forces, was a particular silence that falls when something has happened that seems impossible. Tommy McGuire was the kind of person who felt permanent, not invincible. Anyone who had spent time in the Pacific knew that no one was invincible, but permanent in some less rational way, like a force of nature, like something the war needed and therefore couldn't take. His body was not recovered immediately. The jungle was dense, the terrain treacherous, and the circumstances of the war made extended search operations impractical. For a time, there was hope, faint, procedural, the kind of hope that families and units maintain, because the alternative is unbearable. Eventually, it extinguished. Richard Bong learned of McGuire's death from a dispatch, and reportedly went quiet for a long time. The competition that had defined the latter part of both their combat careers was over in a way neither of them had imagined. Bong's score stood at 40, McGuire's at 38. Bong survived the war, only to die on August 6, 1945, the same day the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima. In the crash of a jet fighter, he was test piloting in California. The Pacific had one more cruelty to distribute before it was finished. McGuire was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The citation, signed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, described his combat record with the kind of measured military language that inevitably falls short of the man it's trying to describe. 38 aerial victories, multiple engagements against overwhelming odds, leadership by example, uncommon valor. The words are true. They are insufficient. What is Tommy McGuire's legacy? And why does it matter now, more than 80 years after the sky over Los Negros Island swallowed him? The immediate, measurable legacy is straightforward. McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey, the base that shares a runway with what is now Joint Base McGuire-Dix Lakehurst, one of the largest military installations on the East Coast, carries his name. Tens of thousands of servicemen and women have passed through that installation. Many of them have never heard the story of the man whose name marks the gate. The tactical legacy is more complex and more interesting. McGuire's approach to aerial combat, his intuitive, engineering-informed practice of energy fighting, his doctrine of altitude and speed as primary tactical resources, his insistence on the geometry of the attack over the mechanics of the turning fight, was vindicated by the war's outcome, and then formally codified by the theorists who came after him. John Boyd, the Air Force pilot and strategist whose energy maneuverability theory revolutionized fighter aircraft design and aerial combat doctrine in the 1960s and 1970s, was building on a foundation that McGuire and others like him had laid with their lives. The F-16, designed using Boyd's principles, is in many ways a descendant of the philosophy that McGuire practiced over New Guinea and the Philippines. Every modern fighter pilot who understands the relationship between energy, position, and lethality is, in a distant but genuine sense, thinking in a tradition that McGuire helped establish. The personal legacy is perhaps the most haunting. McGuire died doing the one thing he had taught everyone around him not to do, not out of ignorance, not out of recklessness, but out of loyalty. He broke his own rules to protect a wingman. Whether that decision reflects a failure of discipline or an expression of the deepest kind of character is a question that different people answer differently. His surviving fellow pilots, in interviews conducted decades after the war, were almost unanimous in their view that final maneuver was Tommy McGuire doing what Tommy McGuire had always done, putting everything on the line for the man beside him, accepting the risk because someone else needed him to. It cost him everything. It saved his wingman's life. There is a photograph of McGuire, taken sometime in 1944, standing beside one of his pudgy aircraft. He is in his flight gear, squinting slightly in the Pacific sun, looking at the camera with an expression that is difficult to read. It is not the staged heroism of a war poster. It is something more complicated. Something that looks like a man who has been to a place that changes you and has come back changed, and who is looking at the camera from across that distance, from the far side of that experience. He was 23 in that photograph. He looks older. Everyone did. Out there, what do we owe the Tommy McGuires of history? Not just the victories. Not just the citation language and the base names. We owe them the effort of actually seeing them, actually understanding what they did, how they thought, what drove them, what they were afraid of, what they loved, and what they died for. He loved Maryland. He loved flying. He loved, in his competitive, intense, engineer's way, the mathematical puzzle of aerial combat. The problem of how to put a machine in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment to make an impossible shot become an inevitable one. He was grounded once for being too good at it. He was needed back because no one else could do it like him. And in the end, the only thing that brought him down was his own refusal to let someone else pay the price he was willing to pay himself. That is not recklessness. That is a particular kind of courage that has no clean name. The courage that knows the cost and pays it anyway. Not for glory, not for the record, but for the person flying 200 feet off your wingtip who needs you to show up one more time. The sky over the Pacific remembers nothing. It is vast and blue and indifferent. But somewhere beneath it, in the record books and the base names and the doctrine manuals and the conversations between fighter pilots who still argue about energy management and the geometry of the attack, Tommy McGuire is still present, still flying, still pushing. If this story moved you, if you found yourself gripping your armrest at any point in the last 20 minutes, then you already understand why this channel exists. These are not comfortable stories. They are not supposed to be. The people in them were not comfortable people. They were extraordinary human beings placed in extraordinary circumstances, and they responded in ways that demand to be remembered. If you learned something today, or felt something, hit the like button. It sounds like a small thing, but it genuinely helps this channel reach the people who need to hear these stories. Every like is a vote for this kind of history. The real history, the human history, not the sanitized version. Subscribe to WW2 Ghost Wings if you want more. We dig into the stories of the textbooks rush past. The pilots, the crews, the tacticians, the ordinary people who did impossible things and came home changed, or didn't come home at all. Every week, we go back to find them. And here's what I want you to think about and tell me in the comments. Tommy McGuire broke his own cardinal rule in the final moment. He turned slow and low to protect his wingman. Was that a failure of discipline or the highest expression of what a combat leader can be? Was he wrong to do it, or was he, in that moment, exactly right? I genuinely want to know what you think. Next week, we're going to tell the story of a man who looked at a briefing map, saw what his commanders planned, and quietly told him it wouldn't work. They didn't listen. He flew the mission anyway. And what happened over the Ploiești oil fields in Romania will make you rethink everything you believe about duty, command, and the price of being the only person in the room who knows the truth. Don't miss it. To everyone in this community who keeps showing up, who shares these stories, who writes in with your own research and questions and your grandfather's memories, thank you. These stories belong to all of us. We keep them alive together. See you in the sky.